On the edge of a cold gray sea, there was a small village called Blackshore. The village was quiet, peaceful, and far away from busy cities. Small fishing boats rested near the harbor. Old stone houses stood beside narrow streets, and every evening the sound of waves filled the air. At the top of a steep cliff stood an old lighthouse. The lighthouse had been there for more than 100 years. People in the village believed the lighthouse protected them. Every night, the bright light guided ships safely through storms and darkness. And every night, one man climbed the long spiral stairs to light the lamp. His name was Elias. Elias was 62 years old. He had silver hair, tired eyes, and rough hands from years of hard work. He lived alone inside the lighthouse after his wife passed away many years earlier. The villagers respected him, but they also thought he was strange. He rarely spoke. He walked slowly through the village every morning, bought bread and tea, then returned to the lighthouse before sunset. Children whispered stories about him. Some believed he could speak to the sea. Others thought he was hiding treasure inside the lighthouse, but nobody truly knew him. One rainy afternoon, a 17-year-old girl named Nora arrived in Blackshore. She came to stay with her uncle after her parents moved overseas for work. Nora did not like the village. She missed the city. She missed bright streets, crowded cafes, music, and friends. Blackshore felt too silent, too slow, too lonely. One evening, while walking near the cliffs, Nora noticed the lighthouse for the first time. Rain clouds moved across the sky, and the sea below crashed violently against dark rocks. The lighthouse stood tall against the storm like a giant watching over the ocean. For some reason, Nora could not stop staring at it. Then she noticed a small light moving inside. Someone was climbing the stairs, curious. Nora walked closer. The wind pushed against her coat as she reached the lighthouse door. She knocked once, no answer. She knocked again. Slow footsteps approached, the door opened. Elias stood there holding an old lantern for a moment. Neither of them spoke. "You should not be here during a storm," Elias finally said. His voice was calm and deep. "I just wanted to see the lighthouse," Nora replied. Elias studied her carefully, then he stepped aside. "Come in before the rain gets worse." Nora entered. Inside, the lighthouse smelled of salt, oil, and old wood. The walls were covered with maps, clocks, ropes, and photographs. A fire burned quietly in a small stove. Nora looked around with fascination. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Elias said nothing. He simply returned to his work. Nora watched him clean the lantern glass carefully. "You really do this every night?" she asked. "Yes." "Even during storms?" "Yes." "Aren't you tired of it?" Elias stopped moving, then he looked toward the sea through the window. "The sea never rests," he said softly. "So neither can the lighthouse." That answer stayed in Nora's mind long after she returned home. The next day she visited again. And the day after that, slowly, Elias became used to her presence. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes tea, sometimes she simply sat quietly while Elias worked. Over time, she learned his routines. Every evening before sunset, he checked the weather, he cleaned the glass, he prepared the lamp. Then, exactly at dusk, he lit the great light above the sea. He never missed a single night. One evening, Nora noticed an old photograph on the wall. It showed a young Elias standing beside another man. The second man looked strong and confident. He wore a captain's coat. "Who is that?" Nora asked. Elias became unusually quiet. "My brother," he answered. "What happened to him?" For a long moment, only the sound of rain filled the room. "His ship disappeared at sea 30 years ago." Nora immediately regretted asking. "I'm sorry." Elias nodded slowly. He was returning home during a terrible storm. The lighthouse light failed that night. Nora looked at him carefully. "Failed?" The old keeper fell asleep. Elias stared at the flame inside the lantern. "My brother's ship struck the rocks before dawn." Nora felt cold. "And after that, you became the keeper?" "Yes. Because of your brother?" Elias nodded once. "That is why I never allow the light to go out." For the first time, Nora understood him. The lighthouse was not just a job, it was a promise. Days turned into weeks, winter slowly arrived, the sea became darker and more dangerous, strong winds screamed against the cliffs at night, fishing boats returned earlier each day. One afternoon, the village received terrible news. A massive storm was moving toward Blackshore. The fishermen secured their boats. Families covered windows. People hurried through the streets carrying supplies. Everyone feared the coming storm. That evening, Nora climbed the hill to the lighthouse. The sky looked almost black. Waves rose like mountains. When Elias opened the door, Nora immediately spoke. "You shouldn't stay here tonight." Elias calmly continued preparing the lamp. "I must. The storm could destroy the lighthouse." "It has survived worse." Nora looked terrified. "Please, come to the village." Elias smiled faintly. "If ships are still at sea, they will need the light." Before Nora could answer, thunder shook the building, rain exploded against the windows. The storm had arrived. Suddenly, the entire lighthouse trembled. Nora grabbed the table. Outside, giant waves crashed against the rocks below. The wind sounded almost human. Elias lit the great lamp. A powerful beam cut through the darkness. For several hours they stayed awake together. Nora helped carry oil. She cleaned water from the floor. Elias watched the sea carefully from the windows. Near midnight, Nora saw something. "There," she shouted, far away between the waves. A ship moved dangerously close to the cliffs. Its lights flashed weakly through the storm. Elias immediately understood. The captain cannot see the rocks. The lighthouse suddenly shook violently. Then everything went dark. The lamp had gone out. Nora froze.
No, Elias rushed toward the mechanism. Water from the storm had damaged part of the system. "The backup flame," he said quickly. He grabbed another lantern, but before he could move, a terrible cracking sound echoed through the lighthouse. Part of the upper stairs collapsed.
The path to the lamp room was blocked. Nora stared upward. "What do we do?" Elias looked at the trapped staircase, then at the sea, then at the small emergency lantern in his hands. Without hesitation, he wrapped a thick coat around himself. "I'm going outside." "Outside?" Nora cried. "You'll die. There's another way to the top." He pointed toward an old iron ladder attached to the outside wall of the lighthouse. Rain smashed against the windows. The wind screamed like an animal. No normal person would climb outside in such weather. But Elias opened the door. Nora grabbed his arm. "Please don't go." Elias looked at her calmly. "If I do nothing, those sailors may never return home." Then he stepped into the storm. Nora rushed to the window. She could barely see him through the rain. Slowly, Elias climbed the ladder while the wind fought against him. The sea crashed below like an endless monster. Twice he nearly slipped. Nora held her breath. Finally, he reached the top. A few seconds later, the great lighthouse beam returned, bright, strong. Alive far below, the ship slowly turned away from the rocks. It disappeared safely into the darkness. Nora almost cried with relief. Minutes later, Elias returned inside completely soaked. His hands shook from the cold, but he smiled. "The ship changed course," he whispered. "You saved them," Nora said. Elias looked toward the sea again. "No," he replied softly. "The lighthouse did. By morning, the storm had passed. The village survived and news quickly spread about the ship that escaped disaster during the night. For the first time in many years, the villagers climbed the hill together to thank Elias. Fishermen shook his hand. Children smiled at him. Some even called him a hero. Elias seemed uncomfortable with the attention, but Nora noticed something different in his eyes. He no longer looked lonely. Weeks later, spring finally returned to Blackshore. Flowers appeared beside the cliffs. The sea became calmer. Tourists slowly visited the village again. One evening, Nora sat beside Elias outside the lighthouse while the sun disappeared into the ocean. "I used to hate this place," she admitted. Elias chuckled quietly. "I know. But now," Nora smiled. "It feels like home." The old keeper nodded slowly. "The sea changes people." Nora looked at the lighthouse light turning across the darkening water. "What will happen when you retire?" she asked. Elias remained silent for a moment. Then he surprised her. "Maybe," he said carefully, "someone else will keep the light burning." Nora smiled. Far below, waves rolled endlessly against the shore, and above them the lighthouse continued shining through the night, a promise, a memory, a light that refused to disappear.